In 1880, Russian composer Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky commemorated the successful Russian defense against Napoleon's invading Grand Army in 1812 with the music that you hear, the 1812 Overture. It is a 15-minute long piece that climaxes with the great cymbals and drums and cannon booming that often accompanies many of the fireworks displays on the coming weekend, the 4th of July. We're going to see how the Russians resist the French along with the other nations. Then we will see Napoleon's greatest blunder, the Russian invasion. We'll then follow with the War of the Sixth Coalition, and then Napoleon's abdication, followed by the return of the Bourbons for a time, followed by the Congress of Vienna. There was, of course, plenty of resistance to the French, and the leading resistor of Napoleon and the French were the British. Napoleon responded by attempting to create what was known as the Continental System. It was an embargo, and this was in response to the British blockade of the European coast. It was intended to bankrupt Britain and her colonies through an embargo on the continent. It had the exact opposite effect. Britain controlled the seas, and so they were never really hurting for trade. Instead, it weakened the nations of Europe that traded heavily with Britain, and therefore it weakened Napoleon's standing among these nations. There was resistance to the French in other places as well, not just in Britain. In Italy, you had what were known as the Carbonari. They were called the charcoal burners in translation. This was an Italian secret society. It was more of an informal network of social revolutionary societies. Very much the way later on the Viet Minh would become in Vietnam, and also Al-Qaeda, in the sense that Al-Qaeda is sort of the coordinating body for the various Muslim revolutionaries in the Middle East. The Carbonari spurred what was known as Risorgimento, which is the growth of Italian nationalism. Remember, Italy was not a nation at this time. You had the Kingdom of Savoy, but you also had the Papal States. You had the various small republics around Venice and Florence and so forth, Naples and on and on. But you don't have one Italy. Italy is still about 50 years away from coming together as a nation. You also had a great deal of resistance in Spain. A 6-year civil war called the Peninsular War erupted when Spain would not adhere to the continental system. So Napoleon invaded Spain, forced the abdication of the Spanish Bourbon kings, and placed his brother Joseph on the throne of Spain, where he would rule for 5 years. The war becomes a brutal struggle of guerrilla warfare. Eventually, the French were defeated by the Spanish with the help of the British. I don't know if anybody watches any of the BritBox TV, but there is a series called Sharpe's War, starring Sean Bean. As you know who Sean Bean is, he's Boromir from Lord of the Rings, and he is also Ned Stark from Game of Thrones. He stars in it. But the French are defeated, and the British help restore the Spanish Bourbons to the throne. The Peninsular War was actually 3 times more destructive than the Spanish Civil War that would erupt in 1936, which would be the training ground for World War II. Joseph Bonaparte was never really accepted as the king of Spain. The clergy and the nobility who could have gotten behind him simply rejected him. And so Joseph Bonaparte would rule for only 5 years in Spain. On this map, you see the French nation in dark green, and then the other nations that supposedly ascribe to the continental system. Most of the nations only on its face ascribe to the continental system. There was a great deal of smuggling that went on during this time. Napoleon's most foolhardy campaign was when the Russians decided to trade again with Britain, and Napoleon decided to invade Russia to punish them and force them back into the embargo. In 1812, he set out from Tilsit, Poland, to invade Russia with his Grand Army, consisting of over 600,000 men, about 450,000 of them French, and the remainder from its allies. However, when one invades Russia, one should keep in mind several things. Number one, Russia is a vast country, and it gets vaster as one moves east toward Moscow. Number two, the Russian peasantry does not like invaders, so much so that they would burn their own farms and crops and become guerrillas in order to deprive the enemy of needed supplies. Number three, in the winter, Russia is not cold. It is fucking cold. Remember that Russia lies about on the same parallel as Canada. Southern Russia lies around the same latitude as the northern United States, and there is very little that keeps the polar winds from coming down on the Russian steppes. We're talking about temperatures that can get 40 and 50 below for the high that day. As a result of this, Napoleon could only rely on a supply line that got longer and more difficult to defend the farther into Russia he marched. And so the Russians chose their strategy, that they would retreat in front of the Grand Army, and behind Napoleon's lines, they would conduct what is known as a scorched earth policy. They would burn every farm, rick, cot, barn, silo, storage, warehouse, whatever, to deprive the French of the necessary food, not just for the men, but for the horses. A horse eats 10 times as much as a human being does. Then they would cut the French supply lines from the rear. Napoleon kept marching in toward Russia nonetheless. The joy of battle was on him. His dander was up. At the Battle of Borodino, outside of Moscow, the largest and bloodiest battle of the Napoleonic campaigns took place. Once again, Napoleon won the battle, but the Russian army escaped yet again. Napoleon now enters Moscow. There's no one there. The city has been completely abandoned, and it was burned of all its supplies. Napoleon wandered around with his army for 5 weeks, waiting for a surrender that would not come. And in those 5 weeks, winter arrived. Napoleon began his retreat from Moscow in the winter of 1812, with a lack of food for both the men and the horses. Dwindled his army to 40,000. An army that numbered 600,000 dwindled to 40,000 men as typhus, dysentery, starvation, and hypothermia ensured that only about 10,000 men of the main force returned across the Russian border alive. Napoleon then left the remainder of his army in Poland, and through an incredible carriage and cavalry ride, he made it back to Paris in time to stabilize for the time the situation. Even the French were getting to be a little bit, we say, uneasy with Napoleon. Few understood it at the time, but the Russian invasion and the subsequent retreat from Moscow would cost Napoleon his crown. And Tchaikovsky in 1880 would end his great 1812 overture with the following. This map chart shows the march and decline of the Grand Army in the Russian campaign. The map here shows the march of Napoleon from Tilsit to Moscow and back. The march from Tilsit to Moscow and back is roughly the equivalent of walking from Chicago to Los Angeles. This is the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow, erected in 1812 by Tsar Alexander I to commemorate the defeat of the French by the Russians. It was destroyed by Stalin to build a communist-style palace for the Soviet parliament in 1937, but the war interrupted the construction of it, and it never got built. It was rebuilt in 1995 after the fall of the Soviet Empire. This is Napoleon watching the fire of Moscow in September of 1812. You notice the towers of the Kremlin behind him and to the right, and the fire that's going on throughout Moscow. It's hard to conquer a country when the country has no one that wants to surrender. This is the night bivouac of Napoleon's army during the retreat from Russia. This painting is Napoleon and the Grand Army on retreat from Moscow in the dead of the Russian winter. The painting is by Adolphe Norvin. With the disaster in Russia, all of the countries that Napoleon had defeated and put under his sway joined with Great Britain and rose up against the emperor in what was known as the War of the Sixth Coalition. The Sixth Coalition consisted of Great Britain, Russia, Prussia, Spain, and Portugal against the French. Joseph Bonaparte abdicated the throne of Spain in 1813 after Napoleon withdrew forces from the peninsula to help in Central Europe. They fought at the Battle of Dresden in 1813. There's that city of Dresden again in Germany. Keep that in mind. We're going to come back to Dresden several times in this course. The Battle of Dresden is a French victory, but it is not enough to defeat the coalition. At the Battle of the Nations, outside the city of Leipzig in 1814, you see the coalition has finally decided rather than to fight Napoleon piecemeal, they fight him together under one unified command. This is the largest battle in European history prior to the First World War. Napoleon is defeated and forced to retreat. At this point, the Allies offer Napoleon a peace plan. Return France to its former borders, or its natural boundaries, as it was said, but Napoleon gets to stay as emperor. Napoleon obviously should have taken the deal, but he had refused it. And after Leipzig, the offer was no longer on the table. So these are the nations allied against each other in the War of the Sixth Coalition. The nations in red are the members of the Sixth Coalition. In blue, obviously, is France and the Napoleonic forces. With the armies of Europe prepared now to invade France, the French Senate that Napoleon had put together now believed that France itself might be liquidated. So they passed a resolution deposing Napoleon, but they were unable to enforce it. However, Napoleon's general staff mutinied against him, and so the emperor knew the game was up. Napoleon wrote down an abdication document in which he said that he was going to abdicate in favor of his son. But the British said no Bonapartes on the throne of France, and the coalition forces demanded an unconditional surrender and an end to the Bonaparte dynasty. They all met in Fontainebleau Palace in Paris in 1814. The treaty was written by the Austrian minister Count Metternich. The Treaty of Fontainebleau contained 21 articles requiring complete abdication of Napoleon from the throne of France. Napoleon could keep the title of emperor. He would be exiled to the island of Elba, which is just to the north and east of Corsica. He would be the emperor of this small island, Elba. He was allowed to take along a staff of 400 people. The British opposed this idea. They said he should be completely abdicated and sent out of Europe completely. However, the treaty is about compromise. Once the Treaty of Fontainebleau got rid of Napoleon from France, the Treaty of Paris of 1814 ended the War of the Sixth Coalition. And so Napoleon went to Elba and literally took over the island, organized it, made it into a great government, and watched and waited. There circled is the island of Elba in the Mediterranean, right off the coast of Italy and within sight of Corsica. France had been under the revolutionary government from 1789 to 1800. It was then under the rule of Napoleon from 1800 until 1814. That was 25 years of upheaval in France. Once Napoleon was deposed, many of the people in France said, well, let's go back to the Bourbons. They turned to Louis Stanislaus, the former Comte de Provence, and the second oldest brother of Louis XVI, with whom he did not really get along too well. Louis XVIII, the man who would become Louis XVIII, spent 1/3 of his life in exile because of the revolution and because of Napoleon. He actually spent more time in exile than he spent as king. Now, early in the Napoleonic reign, he tried to broker a deal where he could be the king, like the chief of state, and have Napoleon as the emperor, sort of the head of the government. But Napoleon instead tried to force Louis to renounce his claim to the throne. When he was brought back to occupy the throne, Louis took the title Louis XVIII in order to honor his young nephew, the Dauphin, who had died in prison. And so the young Dauphin would be Louis XVII, and I showed you his heart in an earlier lesson. In order to have a Bourbon restoration, he knew that the ancient regime, the old kingdom, would not be acceptable to the French. So he went around promising that he would have a British-style constitutional monarchy with a national assembly still intact. He was going to have civil rights. He was going to have more freedom of expression. However, once he comes back, he starts making a number of mistakes, and one of those is going back on many of his promises. Now, he does allow civil rights and freedom of expression, but he makes a major mistake by attempting to restore property taken from the nobles during the revolution and giving it back to them. This was not acceptable to many people in Europe. Meanwhile, the Allied nations met in Vienna to decide on the future of France and Europe. Many of the Allied nations wanted to liquidate France and divide it up. That was not acceptable, however, to the coalition because they understood that France needed to be kept whole as a power because it would serve as an effective counterbalance to the Russians and the Prussians. The major powers at Vienna were Russia, Prussia, who were sort of minor major powers, if that makes any sense to you. And then you had the three real major powers. Great Britain was represented by the man in the upper right-hand corner, Robert Stewart, Lord Castlereagh. Lord Castlereagh was an Anglo-Irish statesman. That means he was English ethnically, but he was born in Ireland. He served as foreign secretary for Britain. He was a rather troubled man, prone to overwork. He was one of those who suppressed the Irish Rebellion in 1798. He forged a coalition against Napoleon in the Sixth Coalition. He would eventually commit suicide in 1822. And many people thought that he had basically been very wroth with guilt over what happened in Ireland and because of his hard work. Representing Austria was the man in the bottom right-hand corner, Prince Clemens von Metternich, whom I mentioned earlier. Metternich was born into a diplomatic family. He wrote the Treaty of Fontainebleau. He was a conservative who wished to maintain a balance of power and crush nationalism. He would also later be seen as a stumbling block to Austria's future. He did not allow Austria to liberalize as much as it could have. He would be the chief guide of European affairs for almost half a century. And in the center of the photos was perhaps the most complex and interesting of the men. He represented France, which was seen as a necessary nation to maintain the balance of power. His name was Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgord, better known as simply the Prince of Talleyrand. You are looking there at the ultimate survivor. He worked at the highest levels of successive French governments, most commonly as foreign minister or in some other diplomatic capacity. He once served as ambassador to England. His career spanned the regimes of Louis XVI, the French Revolutionary government, the Napoleonic government, Louis XVIII, and then later King Louis Philippe. And he survived all of that. Originally, he was a priest and a bishop who abandoned his holy orders during the Revolution and then later was laicized in 1802 by the Pope. That means he was made not a priest anymore. He was known as a voluptuary, that is, he loved his pleasure. He was a chef, connoisseur of wines. He survived the Revolution. He survived the upsurges during Napoleon's rule and the Bourbon Restoration simply because he was so good at his job. He was also institutionally corrupt. Now, what do I mean by that? The French foreign ministry was essentially unfunded by the king. The king told the foreign ministry, find your own funding. So in order for other nations to do business with each other, their foreign ministers essentially called for bribes. You had to pay in order to play. This kind of gives you an understanding of how things are in Louisiana and its close ties with France and so forth. But this institutional corruption, where he required bribes from people to negotiate with him, caused the XYZ affair in the United States, which is covered in the first half of United States history. And it was his machinations that allowed Napoleon to sell Louisiana to the United States. Now, he disagreed at times with Napoleon, but he developed a very, very close admiration for the man, a friendship almost. And after Napoleon was outed and removed as emperor, there's Talleyrand in Vienna, because he was most able to represent the interests of France. And he had helped in the Bourbon Restoration. All of these men and their assistants would try and restore the map of Europe. The goals of the Congress was to restrict and roll back French aggression, provide a check and balance on Prussia and Russia, who were growing powers, restore traditional rulers like the Bourbons in France and the House of Orange in the Netherlands, respect the smaller nations, end the slave trade, create a new German confederation out of the old Holy Roman Empire. And since Metternich was the guiding hand in these negotiations, and Metternich was Austrian, which is where concert music came from, this became known as the Concert of Europe. The Concert of Europe would establish conservatism instead of revolution, and it would hold Europe together until events overwhelmed it a century later in 1914. This is the map of Europe after the work of the Congress of Vienna. You will see that France has been returned to its pre-revolutionary boundaries. The new German Confederation, marked by the red line, would have both Prussia and Austria as its two main powers. Now, one can see that parts of both Prussia and Austria lay outside the Confederation, and that is because these states also encompass territories not inhabited by Germans but by Slavs, and the Slavs wanted nothing to do with the German Confederation. However, with the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire, the German Confederation begins its long march towards political unity that it will finally achieve in 1871 under the leadership of Prussia.